Producers captured the pulse of New York City quite like my next guest did in the 2000s. There was a certain vibe, attitude, and yearning that was alive here in the tri-state and definitely throughout the U.S. A time period ripe for someone to come along and harness that energy through the extraordinary bands and artists he had the opportunity to work with. Best known for his work with the Strokes, he captured the grit, cool, and restless energy of downtown Manhattan at a time when New York was reclaiming its place at the center of rock music. His production blended a lo-fi edge with sharp melodies, shaping and coloring albums that would soon become the soundtrack of a new generation and influencing countless indie bands that followed. It is with great honor that I bring to you producer extraordinaire, Gordon Raphael.
That was very nice.
So let's start in the beginning. I know you're from Seattle.
Born in the Bronx, grew up somewhere in there. Mom's from Brooklyn, dad's from Bronx, born in Bronx.
Oh, wow. Okay. But formative years, obviously, in Seattle.
All my music training and all my bands and my production work was brewing in Seattle.
Very cool. Were your parents musicians?
My dad was a jazz saxophone player, did clarinet and flute, listened to jazz music all the time. And he actually brought home a couple rock and roll records in the 60s that just completely transformed my universe. And that kind of got me on my path.
Nice. Do you remember which records those were?
How did I forget? The beginning of everything. Sgt. Pepper's when it just came out, and another one by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention called We're Only in It for the Money, which was weirdly a parody of Sgt. Pepper's.
That's right.
Yeah. But both of those albums just got me thinking how much there really was to learn in life and what pathway to go on.
Did your dad's music have any influence on you at the time, or was it more just in the periphery?
I really didn't dig jazz,
Okay.
Even before I was really thinking about music, it sounded like he played his sax to big band music and it didn't register with me. And then after I started liking rock music, he would say, that isn't even music. It's just so elementary. And I'd listen to his jazz and go like, that's just noise. We had like a definite battle of our senses for a long time growing up. Yeah.
I could relate to that in some regards.
My dad said, you're wasting your time listening to John McLaughlin and Jimi Hendrix because the electric guitar is soon going to go the way of the accordion. It's just a fad.
Wow. So he was committed.
Yeah. To give him credit, he loved his jazz musicians that he saw when he was a kid. He would sneak to Manhattan and see all the really big guys, Ornette Coleman and Coltrane and Miles Davis. And so he loved them as much as I love my pantheon of David Bowie's and Iggy Pop's and John Lennon. So we were very similar, just different characters.
But I'm sure the more avant-garde stuff trickled in at some point.
No, the only jazz I liked was Mahavishnu Orchestra, like John McLaughlin, because he had rock and roll spirit. He was playing so fast that he was going off the rails like Hendrix, and he had the ability to get back on the rails rather than somebody who was just so intellectually knowledgeable that they had so much control of very avant-garde and intellectual processes. That just never thrilled me. I just liked the looseness and the daring and the completely getting lost aspect of rock music.
Yeah, totally. So it starts with Zappa and the Beatles and then probably a few others soon after.
Hendrix.
Yep.
And then progressive rock was a big thing because I was a keyboard player. And this whole genre of rock music featured keyboard players and synthesizers. And that was like my golden gateway into the future.
Yeah, definitely. I assume you started with piano first.
Piano. And then I played electric organ in rock bands starting when I was 13, because you could haul a Fender Contempo electric organ around in a station wagon, but not an upright piano. So I played organ in rock bands, and I just fell in love with the whole experience of performing and being loud and having people watch. All that stuff affected me greatly.
So you were gigging very early on.
Yeah, 13.
It makes sense. What were the early bands you were in?
The big deal when I was growing up in Bellevue, Washington, was you had to play like 4-hour sets of cover tunes. So whatever was on the radio, that's what they wanted in the venues. But the very first band I got in with another 13-year-old kid who played guitar, he was writing already shoeboxes of his own music. He was like a prodigy, and his music was very interesting. So the very first band I was in was playing all originals, but not mine. and then many, many bands, like 10 bands playing cover tunes of whatever was the Bee Gees, Yes,
Elton.
John, this kind of stuff. And that's kind of how I grew my chops.
I'm sure helped when it came time to do your songwriting too.
Mm-hmm. The big thing that helped was right when I was really trying to write songs and really hitting a wall, I got to go see the Talking Heads and the Ramones and Blondie on their very first tours, like 3 different shows.
Oh, wow.
It kind of really just drove home this point through my brain. Hey, I don't have to wait till I'm as good as Jimmy Page to go make my own song. If people are loving these Ramones songs, I'm ready now. It just kind of broke something down where I felt very encouraged to just start from where I was rather than trying to do bar talk, and
Right.
top level compositions, which I wasn't able to do. I did not have the mind or technique for it, but I sure could do Devo and the Ramones and Talking Heads. I could get into that.
Absolutely. I had a similar thing when I was 16 or 17. I saw Helium and Sonic Youth in New York, and that was, I would say, life-changing thing to witness, because I hadn't seen anything like that up until that point.
There wasn't really.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So from there, what were the bands that you could call your own? I know you were in Sky Cries Mary later on. And
Sky
then
Cries Mary was like a pinnacle.
Yes.
Before that, as soon as I could write my own songs, then was not interested in cover bands. I started my own groups. The first one called Mental Mannequin, second one called Color Twigs, and I wrote the songs. In Color Twigs, one other guy, my guitar player, also wrote, so we shared the duties. Even in Mental Mannequin, our keyboard player, we had 2 keyboard players, wrote songs, but I was suddenly now a singer and a front person, and that was really good for my head. That was exactly where I wanted to be. And then, as you mentioned, Sky Cries Mary, maybe 10 years after I started my own bands, I went into Sky Cries Mary, and that was the first one that, instead of starving to death and wondering what the hell I'm going to do with my life, it's like, whoa, we just got a record deal and a publishing deal, and we're touring, we're playing on Conan O'Brien and Jon Stewart TV show. That was a huge, monumental, I told you so moment where I was suddenly paying my own rent and my own food for the first time in my adult life. That was a big step, and I'm very grateful to Sky Cries Mary for that part of my journey.
And you all were definitely creating a buzz there in the Pacific Northwest at the time.
Absolutely. Up until the whole grunge thing went down around 96.
Right.
We had lines up. We played the best venues in our town. We played with Hole and Mudhoney and Porno for Pyros and Sonic Youth. So we had fantastic shows.
So who would have been your peers there at the time? Would it have been the bands on the Deep Six comp?
Let's see. Oh, yeah. Before the Deep Six comp, Daniel House had a cassette thing called Pyrrhic Victory. That's where Mental Mannequin and Color Twigs appeared. But by the time of Sky Cries Mary, Pearl Jam was just taking off. Soundgarden was taking off. Alice in Chains. Our peers were the flannel grunge guys, even though we weren't that. And I do love the first album of Pearl Jam and a lot of Soundgarden and a lot of Alice in Chains. I just love that music very much.
And Screaming Trees was very psychedelic early on too.
Yeah.
Were you producing those albums, or was it a little later on?
I was not the producer of Sky Cries Mary. I had already produced 3 or 4 of my own albums, and Sky Cries Mary allowed me to assemble a basement recording setup with all the synths I ever dreamed of and Hammonds and everything like that. So when we weren't performing or touring, I was writing music and learning sampling keyboards and sequencing and digital 8-tracks and things like that. So I was always producing and recording, but I wasn't the main producers for Sky Cries Mary. I did a couple remixes. I had some advice or some input, but I didn't need to. I didn't need to be the boss of that. I was enjoying being a band member with 7 other band members working for our mutual success.
So when was it when you started figuring out that you could be helping bands in terms of getting their sound together?
I had done a few productions even in Seattle before During Sky Cries Mary, bands would come to me because they knew, like, for example, there were members of Mudhoney and Pearl Jam in a previous band called Green River, and they knew I recorded. They were like 18 or 19 years old. And, hey, there's that Gordon guy. Let's invite him for coffee and have him record stuff for us. So I recorded some of their songs, and I was doing little bits. I was mostly concerned with my own music. Like, I didn't really want to, I never thought I need to get into producing other bands. I just thought my songs are going to take me where I want to go. And then after the grunge thing kind of passed, I moved to New York from Seattle with my band. I had a band called Absinthe, which was another musician, Anne, and me, and we moved to New York. And there, suddenly, I had a studio there, and bands started coming to me, and I started working pretty quickly, full time, recording the neighborhood bands in the East Village. And I didn't expect that. I wasn't really looking for that, but it was a great way to pay bills in New York, which were 10 times higher than Seattle, where I'd just come from. So it kind of settled me down, like, oh, I can do this. It's kind of a job now, and I loved working on it.
Because I know you had Transporter Rum in Seattle, right?
Well, Transporterraum was my second studio in New York. My first studio in New York was called Chateau Relaxo.
Relaxo, that's right. Yeah.
And that's where I switched over from like analog recording to learning how to use computers and software. I held out a long time. This is 1998. I had a very bad attitude about computers in the studio. You know, I think it's probably like a lot of people's ideas about AI now. It's like, you're going to have TV screen on while you're playing rock music. Like, come on, that does not make sense to me. But I quickly learned how to make really cool and to love the freedom and flexibility of hybrid analog digital recording.
Sure. I only asked that because you had your studio in Seattle, of course, but then when you came to New York, was that sort of like a philosophical continuation of what you were doing there?
Before I was in Sky Cries Mary and I was penniless, but I still was a composer and a producer, I would just go to my friends' garages who had equipment when they were at work, and anywhere I could get my hands on equipment, I would do that. Borrow it, put it in my living room for a month or two, make an album. But at Sky Cries Mary, then I suddenly had the freedom to get my own stuff. So the basement of Sky Cries Mary house was de facto my first personal studio where I didn't have to borrow anything, and I could just work any day, all day and all night in headphones or speakers and just make music. And then the thing in New York was a huge step up because even though I was doing all this stuff, I had synthesizers and echo machines and all flangers, phasers, you know, many cool stuff, Leslie speakers, basses, guitars. I didn't have condenser microphones. I never used a compressor before. I never used the good preamp. I didn't know what a preamp was. So suddenly at Chateau Relaxo, my partner, Scott Clark, said, "This is Avalon. These are Neves, this is API, this is Manley, this is a Neumann." And suddenly I had this new world at my disposal with a bit of a learning curve for digital using this new software called Logic, which was a German software before Apple bought it.
Apple bought it, right.
The previous company was eMagic. And so I had to learn this digital stuff. And I also had to learn compressors and tube amps and preamps and microphone. Like, it was a lot of learning, but I had been preparing myself for that by years of recording already. And so it was just really a joy to get my hands on that gear.
And I'm glad you mentioned basement because the name of the show, of course, is The Basements for Stars. And for me, the basement, obviously in the suburbs, you know, it's either the basement or the garage. But, you know, in your case, it was basements in Manhattan too. It's kind of where you propel your artistry from. That's kind of why I named the show that, because I feel like the basement is zone zero for honing the craft and sharpening the artistry.
My history with basements, I'll just be real quick about it. My bands in high school played in our Scoutmaster's basement. You know, his son was our bass player. So all our rehearsals were in a basement. And then my Sky Cries Mary studio, I lived in a basement apartment, and that's where my studio was. Chateau Relaxo, interestingly, was in the basement at 56 Ludlow, the same building where the Velvet Underground lived 30 years earlier in the 60s. They lived in the same building a few floors up where they wrote all their songs. So Chateau Relaxo was in the basement. And then right after that was Transporterraum, which was also a basement. So basements are me.
Yeah, that's amazing. So when you ended up recording Ian Brown, was that at Chateau Relaxo?
That was at Chateau Relaxo, you know?
Yeah,
I didn't even know we had a phone number. We had a phone, right? I mostly is landline there. No, I didn't have
sure.
cell phone. I used it mostly to call my band member to tell her, "Hey, I'm down here now. You can come over." And the thing rang, which it never did. And it was this strange British voice. He found our number in a phone book, and he didn't tell me who he was. So I didn't find out I was recording Ian Brown until I recognized his vocals. I said, damn, I know that voice. You know, are you Ian Brown? Yeah, I am. That was like an amazing moment.
Mind blowing.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So what were the bands and artists you were recording there at that time? New York seemed like it was a little more eclectic back then.
Well, you know, the grunge movement from Seattle was the kind of like that, and Nine Inch Nails and stuff was like kind of a giant wave. Jeff Buckley was in there, PJ Harvey was in there, not in my studio, but it was a giant wave of rock music that was finished by the time I moved to New York in 98. It was a really big birthplace of drum and bass, jungle, acid jazz. This is what was going on. But there were tons of artistic bands that were certainly not getting famous or getting signed, but the whole Lower East Side and East Village was running with art music. You know, people with trumpets in their bands, rock bands, just all kinds of stuff. But it was very low key. And somehow they found me because I was playing shows, and my studio started getting a reputation for doing low price demos pretty well. And so, yeah, I met a lot of artistic bands with names like Mellow Mane, Private Man, Pamela Laws. I'm trying to think of any other ones. Trixie from Crystal Method. Like lots of different artists that were just walking around and living in the area would find their way to my studio.
So how long was your run at Chateau Relaxo? How many years were you there?
Let's see. I think, yeah, I started in somewhere in 98, the year I moved to New York. And then after a year, I started really getting things going. Like at first it was rocky learning this stuff and I wasn't working for other people, but within a year, I had a job. And then for 1 year, I applied my job and then we got evicted. Somewhere around late 99, we got evicted. And me and one of my clients, Jimmy Goodman was his name,
Mm-hmm.
he wanted to be my new partner and learn my job. So we found an empty space at 2nd and Avenue A, and we built Transportaround with the help of my bandmates' family from Seattle. They run a great studio called Bear Creek Studio, and they came out with like table saws and helped me build the Transportaround. And we were open the first week of 2000. So that's when we started the second studio, which was Transportaround.
And so that was right there in the Lower East Side.
That was on 2nd and A, just
Yeah.
everything, where all the clubs were, where all the musicians and cool people hung out, I like to think.
Was Moses Schneider involved in that in some way?
Moses came to Chateau Relaxo because many of my clients were Swiss and German, and they said, there's this producer from Berlin who would love your place. And Moses and I became very good friends. And when he found out I was going to go to a second studio, he envisioned bringing lots of bands from Berlin to record at my studio because it would look cool for German bands to say recorded in New York City. Okay. So he helped me invest in my studio. He sent me equipment and money and great moral support. And indeed, at the beginning, he did bring bands over up until 9/11, when suddenly the immigration officers were going like, why are you coming so often to our country? And once he went into the back room of immigration, he never wanted to go back to New York to work.
Understandable. Yeah.
Yeah.
My friend Auden in Frankfurt, he was in that post-hardcore band Harmful. He works with Moses a lot.
Moses is still just kicking ass left and right.
Yes.
I've seen him recently and we keep in touch.
That's very cool. So from that point, you were right in the midst of everything. Were you just immediately recording the rock bands that were native to that area?
Kind of with the extra firepower of my partner, who was in a band with Sammy Yaffa, who used to be in Hanoi Rocks and also done some time with the New York Dolls. He said, Sammy, we got this studio. So all these people were bringing in, it was like acts were being fielded from many sources, and I was the guy to record them. So I did a lot of work and met a lot of very interesting bands that way. Of course, mostly underground,
Yes.
kind of weird bands, arty bands, bands from Mallorca in Spain, bands from Finland, like different places would come over. It was really cool. And it was very good for my, I was still in only my second year of really being a full-fledged producer for other people. So I was really getting good and comfortable and quick with my craft. I had learned to make good drum sounds, which took a long time to get the hang of that. With extra guitars and extra layers and loud screaming vocals, how do you hear the hi-hat? How do you hear the kick drum every time? That really took me a long time of trial and error to get that under control.
Yeah. By the late 90s, I would say early 2000s, did you start witnessing a sort of shift into the bands that were forming and coming out?
It was still dwindling. It was still band scene was not the thing. Band scene was not in fashion. It was like an underground thing. Drum and bass people and DJs and pop music. That was really the big thing. Also, the big thing was the .com revolution.
Yes.
The new internet guys, the whole concept of websites, like all of that was like really what people were concentrating on. It wasn't electric guitars, rock singers, bands, rock shows. There was a scene, but it was like small, several clubs, Baby Jupiter, Luna Lounge, Arlene's Grocery, 5 or 6 places to play in the East Village by that time. But it wasn't like a buzz band, people lining up, super crowds, nothing like that at that moment.
Yeah, interesting. Because, when I was getting into music at the time, especially that was coming out of New York in the early to mid 90s, it was a lot of that noise rock and a lot of, I guess you could say, post-hardcore, like, bands like Helmet, Quicksand, Unsane, Orange Nine. It was a lot of that stuff that, a lot of them still are doing their thing now, but I know what you're talking about. By the late 90s, that stuff had gotten a little hushed.
Yeah. Were you in New York in the mid 90s? Were you in the scene or going out to clubs and stuff?
I grew up in New Jersey. So we were really into very avant-garde music and indie rock. We started going to like Tonic and Knitting Factory. By the end of high school, we were already going.
Right. Special places. Those places, if only a place like that could really exist now. Like the owners and the bookers had an eye for unusual. This is important. This is important. Let's book that. People should see that. This is artistic. Yeah. That guy can really do something new, Did you ever see my friend's band Halcyon?
I know the name. I have not. No, I haven't seen them.
They were a good example of bands that were in the mid 90s in New York that were like noise rock, mathy rock, but a very cool band. They're friends of mine. That's why I asked you.
No, I know the name, but I haven't seen them. I remember Ladio Balaco and Skeleton Key. They were around that time, and I liked them. And then, of course, everything that was sort of like adjacent to John Zorn, we were super into also.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting. But when was it when you started seeing a shift in terms of, I guess you could say, people just really wanting to play just straight up rock music again? I know there was Jonathan Fire Eater was probably one of the earlier examples.
That was everybody whispered that name when I moved to New York, 98. The big thing that's going to happen is Jonathan. Like that was what 2 years before the Strokes came out. People were whispering the name Jonathan Fire Eater. I never saw them, but I heard many important people talking about them. There's a couple other bands that were seemingly going to do something. Really, the next thing that I saw, as soon as I recorded Is This It? It was right after 9/11. I said, I'm getting out of here. And I had a chance to go to England, to live in London and work in London. And all of a sudden, because of the Strokes being first accepted, and they kind of knew more about them in England than it took America a while, maybe 6 months to a year for them to be aware that, there's a band called the Strokes and they're cool. Well, before America even heard a record, there was a record out in England and people already thought they were cool. So during that time, there was an influence of bands starting that, hey, let's get some jeans and let's get electric guitars and let's have cool haircuts and drink some beer and play. So when I moved to London, there was an explosion of a scene playing rock records, rock DJs, young people, rocking out in the new way based on the Strokes, kind of. So around, let's say, 2002. So I recorded Is This It in 2001, and in early 2002, like say 5 or 6 months after Is This It had been released in the UK, I moved to London and I saw this explosion of band power and scene power and shows and parties, and it was just all kicking off. And I thought that was fantastic.
That's interesting. So something that you helped create in New York catapulted to the UK.
Right. And I happened to be there and took full advantage of that moment. Like I was being invited by record labels to come talk to them and sign records for their kids. And I started my own label. I had my own band, was hanging out with the Libertines. It was just a phenomenal good timing for me.
So then it boomeranged right back stateside soon after.
Then, like, after being in London for a year, I came back for Christmas vacation to New York, and suddenly there's kids with leather jackets and guitars walking around the village, which I hadn't seen before that. And also, while I was in London at the club nights, it's like, we got this new band, Interpol, we got this new band, like all these New York and American band, White Stripes coming over, and so I was seeing lots of American bands going to London, being hailed and being celebrated. Yeah. What was the band that I can't remember? The two-piece band with Vivi and Hotel, and they had a drum machine. She went on to play with Jack White in a band. I forget the name of that, but everybody loved them.
The Kills.
Yes, the Kills at our club night, and like, wow, this is incredible.
And then New York started emulating that right away, because I remember we met super briefly at Tiswas at Don Hills. It was probably right after Is This It had really broke here in the States. I remember I walked up to you and I just said, I loved the record and I thought you did a tremendous job on it. And you just said, thank you. And you went that way. I went this way. And that was that.
And sometimes, I'd gone there a lot before Is This It, for my own bands and for like hanging out. It was a rock place to hang out during the non-rock time, kind of.
Yes.
If ever there was a rock scene, that was it. They played Bowie and T-Rex and stuff there.
Suede and Pulp. That was, there wasn't anything like, you had sort of, I call them copycat nights that spawned from Tiswas, but Tiswas was the original, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah.
Now, jumping back a little, when was it exactly when you met the Strokes? That must have been 2000-ish, or
let's see, if I started in January of 2000, I think somewhere around October of 2000, I went to a show at Luna Lounge because I wanted to check out the promoter to see what kind of shows she did. The Strokes were one of two bands that played. So in October or late September is when I saw them play, and I gave them a business card, and I gave the other band a business card too, because I like to work. And the other band didn't call me, but the Strokes came over within a couple days to check out my studio.
Do you remember who the other band was, or is it not
I
important?
sure do. I loved the other band. I wasn't a big fan of the Strokes when I saw them. I loved the other band, and I was hoping they were going to come. They were called Come On, and they were kind of like a new version of British Invasion. They had harmonies and really
I remember them.
Guitar parts. Come On, they were called, and I really wanted them to come, and they didn't. But Albert came over, and pretty soon I learned how to love the Strokes music.
Right. So you recorded the Modern Age EP with them.
That was the first thing we did. It was just not even supposed to be. They wanted to make a demo to get to the better clubs. They were playing free clubs.
Arlene's Grocery, probably.
And the Spirals.
Yep.
Luna Lounge.
Yeah.
And they wanted something to like represent them. And they tried a couple times, and they were having a hard time translating their sound to recordings. They told me that. So I wanted to make sure that they were, to prove myself, like, I'm going to try to make them happy. I'm going to try to give them a sound they like and pay attention. And and during that process, I really learned to really love their music, even though I felt very sorry for them that they were rocking out very seriously, and electric guitars were not in, no label wanted to sign an electric guitar band that year. Mhm.
Was the setup that you used for the EP, did it change at all by the time you started recording Is This It? Or was it pretty much the same sort of setup?
I had a few good preamps, some really cheap Alesis speakers, and one or two decent microphones, but nothing Neumann quality. I had some, Biodynamics and some 421s, SM57s, and a cheap condenser mic by Audio Technica. But for the EP, I only had 8 inputs. So I recorded the band with 8 microphones, and then we recorded Julian singing. Overdubbing would be the 9th channel. And when I learned that they had some success and I was going to get to do the album, I borrowed some equipment. I had a few more good preamps, and I had another set of 8 inputs, which I used, I think, one of. So I had 9. I wound up using very much the same setup with one extra input. Instead of 2 mics on the drums, I'd use 3, for example.
Right.
So yeah, it was very similar setup.
So basically kick and snare and just
Probably kick and snare,
okay.
or kick and a little overhead hanging over between the snare and getting some of the floor tom.
Yeah.
But I also had a room mic that would pick up general. He only had one cymbal, he barely used it.
Right, the ride cymbal he used, yeah.
But the room mic picked up enough drum impact to give it some dimensionality on top of the direct mics.
So really a lot of it was just the room sound.
A lot of all the records I made for them, the room played an important role, and it still does on my production. I mean, I swear by everybody making noise in one room and having things to pick up the bleed, amplify the mess.
And you did get sort of, I don't know if experimental is the right word, but playing with mic placement and using the wall or using other objects in the room.
Yeah, Moses gave me the idea. I don't know if he did or if I imagine he did. One song, I think I wrapped 57 in newspaper and stuck it between the hi-hat cymbals while Fab was playing it.
Oh,
and
wow.
On a couple songs on the album, they wanted their drums to sound like a drum machine. And
That's
so
right.
I used very destructive, like EQ on top of another EQ on top of another EQ to just make piercing noise and then kind of gate that so it would sound like artificial toy drums instead of a guy playing a kit.
Sure. And one thing I've always remarked about Is This It is lo-fi in the sense that it didn't have the big production of like whatever top 40 rock was out at the time. But it didn't take away, it still had a clarity and a distinctness to it, which I really love. It differed from, say, indie records from the 90s where it was extremely lo-fi. What you did was taking that timbre and vibe, but giving it a clarity that, say, bands prior didn't necessarily have access to.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that. Two of the important ones are that unlike most bands I'd ever recorded or been in, the band was meticulous about playing correctly. No speed ups, no wrong notes, no accidental drum part that wasn't pre-planned. Like they were insistent upon working and working and working to make sure that everything was performed clearly. I didn't edit notes into place. It was just,
I was going to ask.
That's how they played, And so that was one thing. And then the second is intellectually, they didn't want something giant sounding. They didn't want something modern and huge. That was something they made clear at the beginning. So there's no overdubs, there's no doubles, there's no harmonies, there's no reverb, there's no tambourine, there's no double vocal, there's no double. It's all just like one thing, and that's how they played it, okay? But they were meticulous during the mixing process of like, I can't hear that G note he just played. Could you raise it up? Okay, great. I can't hear the hi-hat there. Turn it up. Now it's too loud. Turn it down. They were on top of all the details. So that's where the clarity comes from.
Interesting.
They weren't going to let anything be played wrong, and they weren't going to let anything that was played be not heard. It's crazy.
Wow. So you were recording to Pro Tools for that album?
It was Logic software. But I had Pro Tools converters and Pro Tools audio cards in the tank. And that was also a pretty new thing to be able to combine those two things. Yeah, it was very state of the art at the time.
It definitely was. I remember a producer that one of the bands I was in work with, he had Digital Performer, and I had not seen anything. It was so alien to me.
I mean, the reason why at Chateau Relaxo I was trained on Logic is because you could press one numeral key and be recording MIDI for electronic keyboards, and press a different numeral key and play your electric guitar and sing with a microphone. And all the other digital pathways other than Logic, you had to open Pro Tools to record your guitar and then link it with a digital bridge to Performer to record MIDI and then have them syncing. It's just a complete headache, time
Yes.
waster, iffy connection, not strong connection. So Logic was doing this together years before any other software caught hold.
So was anything gridded out for that album, or was it just were they playing to a click?
I think for the first EP, I don't think they used a click or something, but 6 months later, 3 months later, whatever it was, they said, we're doing it with a click. We want the drums to stay like locked in a groove. Like we want that groove of no speeding up. It's not happening. And like Julian, even at the young age that I was working with him,
Yeah.
he could hear the most microscopic speed up or slow down on anything, even if he wasn't paying attention. He just has this uncanny rhythm. I've never seen anything like it. He wasn't going to let it happen, you know?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I know Julian in the early days, he wrote everything, but did the band ever contribute to like fleshing out their own parts, or was Julian very much like, this is the song and these are the parts and everyone just followed suit?
From what I learned, which I didn't know for a few weeks, the album was like Julian had written all the parts, but if he wanted to think about something, he would get the guru, which is JP Bowersock, who was always present at all the sessions when I worked with the band. And he'd say, what would Bo Diddley do if he was like in a spaceship and playing on a Fleetwood Mac song? What scale would he use? And the guru would say, oh, he'd use a Phrygian, but then he'd modulate it right here. And Julian would say, thank you very much. Give me a minute. And he'd say, okay, this is what I want you to do in the middle of the solo. And he'd show Nick some idea that he had developed with JP for like bouncing ideas off of.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So
It's great to watch that. Great to watch that. Yeah.
that makes sense now.
It's so weird. The songs are so weird because they're counterpoint.
Yeah.
The hi-hat is doing this thing and the bass pattern is complementing it like that. And then the two guitars are doing different melody. You have to kind of see the overview. It's not, maybe if I just play a G chord a few times and one time it's not about trying things out. It's about like the way that they interlock, like Bach, like that kind of thing.
Yes. The other thing with that album, which I really found interesting, was you brought your production sensibilities to it, but initially their label was kind of hesitant, right?
No, their label was hating me through the whole thing.
Through the whole thing. Okay. Wow.
When it was all over and done, I didn't feel hatred from them, but I did not feel excitement about or compliments or thank you or anything like that. They really wanted me off the job because they signed the band after we had already started many of the songs. Like
Right.
the band hired me to make the record before they were signed to RCA. And when RCA heard the songs we were working on, they just couldn't wait to get rid of me and get a real producer in the chair because they thought they weren't going to get their investment back.
And I believe the producer they had in mind was Gil Norton.
That was before they even started with me. Yeah, before they even were signed, they started it with Gil Norton. But then after they came back to me, I was still threatened with being taken away from the album because the guy from RCA just thought I was wrecking Julian's voice. And, I didn't know how to make a chorus pop and all this other stuff.
Oh, wow. No, it's funny because he seemed to be for whatever reason, the go-to guy for a lot of indie bands in the 90s and even early 2000s.
I don't know much about him. I just know that before they started working with him, Julian asked me what I thought of this guy. I said, oh my God, he's so good. I mean, he did the Pixies. He's like, he's on the Foo Fighters. He's a major dude. I had respect for him. I don't know anything about his process I just thought this guy's like, how am I going to compete with a guy like that?
Yeah. No, I like his production work. I just find it funny that when indie bands got signed, he was the first person that the label suggested.
Yeah, they wanted Surfer Rosa Pixies success.
Yeah. Yeah. Even after the album was finished, you still felt a little bit of animus or hostility.
Me personally?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the record was hard enough just for the fact of the matter of working with those guys. They were so intense. We had a certain amount of time to do it. There's a lot of work to be done. And to have that extra layer of a guy from a huge record label, you know, just telling me that my work was substandard and I needed to be replaced and, you know, that I was a joker and all the, you know, it affected me greatly. It just added
Wow.
stress to an already difficult situation. It was just hard work doing that album just for the sheer amount of work we were doing, not because of weirdness or bad attitudes. There was great, it was just the sheer number of hours tweaking on the stuff.
And I don't think, say, if they went into the studio with Gilnorn or maybe someone like Scott Litt or something, I don't think that album would have hit the way it did. So much of the album, the way that at least we consumed it and the way we perceived it was very connected to the production.
Yeah, I had such a good time, you know, that it was a great situation for me because I loved the music, loved the vocals, and I have a chance to, like, push things and try things, like, to get I like very aggressive sounds, but I also like beautiful music and intelligence, and to have them both in the same place was really good, and, they liked it. I could tell they were digging it, and I was digging it, so that was the glue and the gold that kept us going through the whole thing.
It's evident in the songs. What I liked about it is, everyone was very quick to compare them to like Television, Velvet Underground, Stooges, whoever.
Mhm.
Obviously, that was there, Ramones, whatever. But the thing that I really liked was it reminded me of a lot of indie rock from maybe half a generation before them. I could hear traces of Guided by Voices. I
Oh,
can,
they love Guided by Voices.
yeah, I can hear John Spencer Blues Explosion. I can even hear Spoon, Pearl Jam, No Code, Vitology. I could hear that in the albums.
They love Pearl Jam. At
Yeah,
least Julian sure does, yeah.
I still does, yes. If they were just trying to ape 70s punk, I don't think it would
No.
have worked for me.
I felt like even when I didn't know them very well, I thought this is kind of like hip hop in a way. There's something about the repetitive groove and the groove going through, you
Sure.
know, it's really reminds me of like hip hop influence in indie rock. What a strange combination.
No, totally. I can definitely hear that in the drum patterns and the drum production for sure. So when it came time to do the follow-up album, what was that process like? By that time, you were
By that time, I was living in London. You know, I moved to London a few months after the release of Is This It? You know, I was living in London and they were touring a lot. They toured for a couple years off of Is This It? Right? And I kept wondering, everybody seems to love this. Am I going to get called back? You know, what's going on? I'm waiting, I'm waiting. And then one day I was hanging out in their management office across from Tompkins Park. I had happened to be in New York and I went in to see if I could talk to any of them, if anyone would be there. And I saw on a board the Radiohead producer's name, Nigel Godrich. I said,
Yeah, that's right.
meeting with Nigel Godrich on Tuesday. I'm thinking, oh my God. And when some of the boys came in, I said, excuse me, what's that all about? Oh yeah, we always wanted to work with the guy from Radiohead. We love the Radiohead sound. I was like pretty crushed.
Yeah, which I found strange because as much as I liked OK Computer, I didn't see it translating. When I first read that, I'm like, are they going to try to do some atmospheric rock now? Like, why? I don't understand.
I just was sad for a while. And then just like with Gil Norton, I turned into happy when they said, hey, do you feel like coming to New York to work on an album with us? I go, yes, I happen to be free that month,
Yeah.
whatever. It was a great moment getting that chance to work on Room on Fire.
From what I understand, it just was not working with him. Things were getting lost in translation. They didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things, which makes sense if you think about it.
I didn't dig in very much. I heard one or two quips in the background. You know, it was enough that I was back on the job and I wanted to, you know, prove myself again.
Yeah. So recording that album, obviously you were in a different studio.
right?
I know they wanted you to sort of emulate the vibe from Is This It? So you were tasked with the responsibility in doing some
Decoration.
interior design.
It was a great studio, and I tried to make it look and feel like my old studio, which they wanted. And it was for me, it was a great recording session. It lasted 3 months, which was the longest I ever worked on something up to that point. And in the middle, they went to Japan to play some shows, and I went with them to Japan. And that was really fun too.
But the approach recording Room on Fire didn't differ vastly than how you approach Is This It?
Not
Is This
really.
It?
Not
Yeah.
really. The only difference was after touring for 2 years, they were just, for me, stronger musicians. They just could play and play and play. They were just monstrously huge. So it felt like I had a slightly different band on my hands with Our. But yeah, it was no overdubs, no reverb, just still that stripped down, what you see is what you get kind of thing.
I know you use an Avalon preamp, right?
Yeah, I always use Avalons for the vocals, but funny you mentioned it. They had a fantastic SSL board, a giant, like multi-million dollar, it's whatever, the giant SSL board. And we recorded a lot of songs, drums and bass and guitar through that. And at some point, weeks into the project, Julian decided that he absolutely detested the sound of the guitars going through the SSL. So we had to do a lot of experiments and a lot of science projects to what he called de-SSLify the guitars. So it took a lot of ingenuity and patience to figure out a way to get those guitars to sound different, but we did it in the end.
So a lot of those guitar tracks weren't kept, is what you're saying.
I think what I remember is it was a hot summer.
Okay, yeah.
We found, after me experimenting with everything in the studio, I had a great engineer at that studio. It's a really cool place. His name was Toshi. And somewhere between me and Toshi and the guru, they found this Millennia tube preamp thing. And they kind of routed the guitars through the SSL back into this and back into Pro Tools.
Through the preamp.
So while we were
Wow.
working on it, he was listening to the sound of the digital sound of the SSL in Logic being then processed through the Millennia, which was constantly overheating and turning off. But that's how we got through that session.
I was going to say that and a hot summer is not a great mix.
It was breaking down all the time, but it was really a workaround, but somehow we got there.
Wow, I had no idea.
I wouldn't have thought that the sound was SSL, like, wow, but Julian's tastes are like,
Sure.
every tone is like a cellar full of wines, and each one has a slightly different, je ne sais quoi.
So that was 3 months, and I take it you recorded right through that whole summer.
Yeah. Except for the 7 days we went to Japan. The rest of pretty much recording all the time with a day off here and there.
And you mixed that album too.
All the albums, I worked on it, but so did Toshi, the engineer.
Okay.
So did everybody in the band. Everybody participated in the mix. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can hear, just from listening to those two albums, you can hear the work, the meticulousness of the mixing really comes through.
There was one really weird thing in the mixing of Room on Fire that was very difficult. And that was Julian developed a philosophy when it came to mixing that album. Okay, every instrument, including my vocal, must be the exact same level. Nothing can be louder than anything else, yet I must hear every single thing at all times. And that was hard.
Wow.
Eventually we got there, but also eventually the first thing the critic said when that record came out is, why are the vocals so quiet? What was he afraid of his voice, or what's going on? Is this it? It was already in the mix, but this was like the hi-hat, the kick drum, the guitar, the tom, whatever. It was the same as the vocal. It was just slightly in a different sonic place, but that's what he wanted, and that's what we got.
Was it around that time you worked with Regina Spektor, or was it a little before?
In between.
Yeah.
In fact, the reason I knew about that studio is because that was the room in which I met Regina.
Okay.
And I never planned to work with her. I just wanted to meet her. And when I heard her play, I said, okay, we got to start recording right now. I basically started an album the day I met her.
Wow.
completely unplanned. But that's how I knew about that studio, because I had already had about 10 days of recording with Regina there, and I really liked it.
The album released for Soviet Kitsch at Tonic, because I remember seeing her right when that album was it had just come out or was about to come out. It was a fantastic show. The vibe in the room was a little strange, but were you at that show or
Tonic was her place.
yeah,
The first time I ever saw her live, I already recorded her, but she said, "Come see me play in Tonic." And that's the first time I ever heard that song Chemo Limo, was she had written it that day and played it. And this was like, we're talking about, I guess 2002, like Christmas time, 2002, New Year's 2003-ish. And her record didn't come out for another year after that.
that's
But
right.
she'd already done a national tour of the US opening for the Strokes and Kings of Leon by the time her record came out. That's what kind of got her record out. The labels all heard about, who's this person opening for the Strokes on a piano. That did great things for her.
And she was part of that anti-folk scene that was going on there,
Sidewalk.
Moldy Peaches, Sidewalk Cafe, yeah. Yeah,
Absolutely.
which Strokes were sort of connected to for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Yeah.
was a great thing.
That was a great time when things that you wouldn't expect were sort of converging.
Yeah, and people could still afford to live in New York and play music and be weird and not have to copy trends. It was quickly shifting, but that was like the last era where you didn't have to be a millionaire to like kind of have a roommate and live somewhere in New York City.
It's funny you say that because I feel like what you and the band did at that time was, I remember in the late 90s and early 2000s, obviously you saw it, there was like an influx of people forming bands or people moving to New York to form bands. And not only were they doing that, it was soon after people were just figuring out again that we can record albums ourselves.
Mhm.
So I remember friends of mine that were just in their apartments, DAWs had just come out. So they had a Mac, they had maybe a preamp, and they had a handful of mics, and everyone was just recording themselves. And I'd like to say that you had a hand in that, showing the city that, it's possible. You don't need this giant infrastructure to capture that type of sound that everyone was chasing after at the time.
Yeah, well, I credit my partner at Chateau Relaxo because he was like a computer genius who loved audio. And he kind of put together, you don't need, you just need a few of these great preamps, a really powerful computer, some good speakers, and let's do it that way. So it was kind of an early model of what became very futuristic and now very
Yes.
common.
Exactly. When it came time to do First Impressions of Earth, what was sort of the feeling in their camp at the time? What were you feeling? What was the sentiment?
The most important thing to know is that for Is This It and Room on Fire, they were militarily prepared. They had rehearsed to precision what they were going to do.
Mhm.
First Impressions, they had me come over and build a studio in their practice room in the music building to my spec. And then they wanted me to be there while they spent a year writing some songs, trying to figure out what they're going to do on the next album. So
Oh,
that
wow.
was odd for me because I was used to the preparation and just coming in there, knocking something out. And suddenly I didn't know if I was going to be there for 1 year or 2 years or 3. No, I had an open-ended agreement to just be there while they developed and recorded their album. So that was unusual. They were developing those songs. Everybody's heard First Impressions, so you know what they were thinking. And it was also, they'd been together a while. They were starting to have independent lives. They weren't the usual school buddies hanging out 24/7 like the old days. They were kind of like starting families and relationships, and come after work, they'd split and go their own ways. So it was a slightly different vibe on the music front and on the vibe front. But I was happy to be part of it up until the time they brought in another producer to work with me.
What led to that without prying too much?
It's very clear. At the time that they were writing the music for First Impressions, Albert was very good friends with Sean Lennon.
That's right.
And Sean Lennon was working at, I think it's called Soundhouse or something like that studio. It was run by James Eha from Smashing Pumpkins. I forget the name, what that studio was called.
He was always in that scene, I remember, James E. how you just saw him all over the
Yeah,
place.
yeah, he was a very nice guy,
Yeah.
and Sean was a really nice guy, but, Sean was working with this guy, David Kahn, who had been producing Paul McCartney albums, and he was also a big guy in the music industry in New York. And so one day, Albert said, "Hey, when we start recording the album, I've got this friend, David, and maybe he can come help you." I thought, "Great, some young kid is gonna learn, could be my assistant engineer, and we'll work on this together. I'll have less work to do. He can run the computer, it'd be great." Sure, sure. So I was very surprised that on that special day, this guy came in who was my age or older, and he was kind of very dominant from the moment he came in, like kind of like, "Gordon, sit down. I'm going to change the mics." I'm like, "What? In my studio that I built on my band, on my album project, you're going to move the mics around?" And I look at the band like, "What the hell?" And they go, "Yeah, let him try, let him try." So right from the very first day,
Oh, wow.
it was like, "This isn't how I work. This is nah, I don't do that." I was kind of immediately put off and put to an uncomfortable position, which lasted for about 3 months or something.
And you ultimately
Ultimately, after Christmas vacation, I had been flying around Europe and having a great time recording bands even during Christmas break. And I got back to start the sessions, and they were kind of drifting in like slower than I thought. I was waiting around New York to even hear what was going on. And they took me to a deli around Port Authority, and they said, "Hey, we decided we want to use him instead of you. Is that okay?" And I thought, I was a little sad. I thought, well, if I was a musician, I'd want to work with who I want to work with. So I said, "Of course, go ahead." And I had other stuff I was in the works anyway that I could do immediately. So it was a tough transition, but I guess it worked out for everybody.
Yeah, I do like the album. It's just a shame, obviously, but the songs that you still had some, Razor Blade and Killing Lies, and I think
Electricity Escape.
Electricity Skate, those for me were the more interesting songs on the album. And I don't know if I could attribute that to you.
I
Maybe we can say that.
I doubt it. They're just particularly cool songs. But yeah, that wasn't my idea. The sound of that is definitely not my sound. And that's okay. That's what they wanted to try something different. I cannot blame them. Like the drum sounds on that album compared to Is This It or Room on Fire, they sound like super pro, like big drums. And mine are like explosive, angry toys, like kind of like gnarling in the back, kind of down there in some weird abstract.
Yeah, for me, it's like what could have been type thing,
Yeah.
So chronologically, I don't know if I'm getting the time frame right. Was it afterwards, or when did you start working with Skin from Skunk and Nancy?
It was that Christmas break,
Okay.
she wanted to make an album. I never really heard of her, but her manager sent me a tape, and I go, "Oh,
Mhm.
oh my God, that girl can sing.
Yeah, she's
What
fantastic.
a voice, yeah." And I said, I can't work because I got an endless commitment with the Strokes, but I have a few days off and Christmas. Let's make a bunch of songs." And we did. We made a bunch of songs at my studio in London. And then as soon as I found out I was fired from the Strokes, I called her up and said, "Hey, we can finish that record. We can really do it." So we wound up finishing that record.
Very cool. What other things from that point until
Oh,
now that you feel really passionate about?
yeah.
If there's anything you want to touch on.
In order of vitality, I would say that the fact that a new era of digital music came along and I was able to release my 18 solo albums instead of waiting for a label to sign me, that was a huge thing. And making little videos to promote on social media, that was, just so much fun talking about my music. That's one compartment. The other compartment, also social media related, is I open my Instagram DMs and there's bands from all over the world wanting to work with me. I don't need a manager. Just like, "Oh, wow, I'm going to LA. I'm going to Berlin. I'm going to, Belgium, Amsterdam." So I've been just traveling all over the place, recording cool bands. One band I will plug, because I always love to plug them, is this New York band, Cab Ellis. I made an album with them in Seattle that I love. It's called The East Coast Hold On. And I've worked with them since then on a number of different projects. And I just think they're fantastic, and everybody should look at their videos and see their shows, and I'll just say them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool now because, and I've talked about this with my friends and other guests, is there is a breed of new young bands and artists who are looking backward to the late 90s and early 2000s and picking up on things that maybe for some people just forgotten. And they're really getting inspired, and they're not necessarily copying it or anything. They're finding things within those bands that resonate with them, and they're just taking off from there and making it their own thing.
I think the big thing that's happened since the pandemic is young people missed a couple years of their life. You know, when we were going out clubbing and we were meeting all kinds of girls and boys and having a great time, they were staying home because of distancing rules and shut down events. So this whole generation of young people are playing instruments. They've rejected techno, the internet, whatever. They use all that stuff, but so much young people are playing pianos and drums and violins and singing and, you know, really hands-on music rather than just relying on technological tools to make art. So I think that in every place in the whole world, there's pockets of people going crazy, bands, shows, records coming out, videos, posts. There's a lot of great things happening with live music right now. I think that the idea that there's this huge enthusiasm for playing music right now when everybody says everyone has a short attention span. Well, how did they learn how to play like John Bonham at the age of 19? How did they learn how to master the violin or make their own recordings perfect? You know, they needed a lot of concentration. All is not lost for creativity or the human spirit.
And lastly, are you still cool with any of the guys in the Strokes?
I'm cool with all of them. I mean,
that's very good.
We never were best friends, you know,
right?
But we have a very good feeling about each other. 25 years and no lawsuits. That speaks for itself.
That does, yeah. I know a lot of us really were hoping all of you would reconnect again and possibly do one more thing.
Oh, if I got that phone call, I would not say no. I get a lot of support from people on the daily saying, hey, you know those albums you worked on? Thanks a lot. Good work, you know.
Yeah.
It's very pleasing for me to hear that.
I'll just echo what I said earlier. There was a vibe and a sound happening in New York. There's two producers I always say that defined what New York was at the time. It was you and Dave Siddick.
Right on.
TV on the Radio and Yeah, Yeah, Yeahs. I think the two of you were responsible, at least sonically, what kind of ensued after 2001. Thank you again for coming on.
Okay.
Thank you for all the great music.
Thanks for having me on your show, and keep hanging out in basements.
That was Gordon Raphael. Super thankful to him for making time to come on the pod and talk about his work and discuss a time in music that many of us in the tri-state look back on fondly. I'm going to do a few more episodes and call it a season before summer break. So if you're a musician or artist and you want to come on and talk about your work, please let me know. All my contact info is in the description and the show notes area. The Basements for Stars is a Caspian Seal production. Intro and outro music by yours truly. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you hopefully real soon.